Hello everybody and welcome to Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. I'm Jack and today you can see we have some very special guests with us. This is going to be something we're going to be trying to push forward with the channel over the next few weeks with IRL events returning. We want to get some more player interviews on the go. We want to speak to some more top players in the game and really glean some insight as to one, how you can best prepare for some of these IRL events, but two, also how the metagame evolves and changes throughout the weeks. So as you can see, we have Joe sort of with me as well, but we also have some special guests ready, prepared, I hope, for Brisbane Regionals coming up this weekend. So if you would like to introduce yourself, Natalie, do you want to kick things off?
Sure. Hi, I'm Natalie. I'm from Brisbane. Played Pokemon for 8.5 years, which sounds like a long time in years. I don't know, Henry?
I'm Henry. I'm from Melbourne in Australia. Played Pokemon for about the same time, maybe 9-10 years. And I guess I'm most known for won the last World Championship.
So two very, very strong players with us today. And yeah, so obviously IRL is coming back. We've had 2 years of having no IRL events. Finally, we're starting to see, hopefully, light at the end of the tunnel with all of the pandemic stuff, but also with events coming back. And before we get onto any specific decks and that sort of thing, I think something that is key to, or something that is very evident to, or for a lot of new players, is that this could be like their first ever event. I feel like Pokemon has been huge. It's really blown up over the past couple of years, and obviously preparation is like key to an events like these. So before we get onto anything specific to do with decks, I just want to talk a little bit about, preparing for these kind of events. How has your preparation change from going from online events to IRL events? I know obviously, Natalie, you've done incredibly well in some of the online events recently. So obviously coming from the perspective of, I've done really well in some of these online events. Has your testing changed in terms of moving into IRL, where maybe you were more familiar prior to, I guess, COVID hitting?
Not really. I guess it depends on the kind of online event you're talking about, because I prepared for stuff like the Players' Cup the same way I'd prepare for regionals. But if we're talking about the events on Limitless, usually the event itself was the preparation.
Yeah.
Because there's so many of them, like, you're allowed to take so many more risks. However, with tournaments like Players' Cup and like regionals, there's only one of them, and like it's 7 rounds and you're done. So you cannot take as many risks. I guess that's the big one.
Yeah, that makes sense. Henry, I don't know whether you've got.
Yeah, when it has to be, the only major online tournament I played was the Invitational. I didn't play any of the Players' Cups. And obviously that, by virtue, is completely different because you've got a completely different meta spread of how many people do we have? 8 players or something?
Yeah, it was 8.
Like, 8, yeah. So everyone's going to play a good deck. And so you can get away with a little bit more. Like, you can pick a really narrow spread targeted deck because you're like, well, no one's going to play, like, Rapid Strike Malamar or something, even though that deck's not even terrible anymore. But you get what I mean. And so it's completely different. When it comes to the other online tournaments, even like Players' Cup, we have to factor in open deck list, which I think is the biggest thing that new players are going to adjust to if they've played on the online tournaments, because things like playing really low counts of certain cards, say Switch or something in your deck, you can get easily punished for in an open list. But in a closed list, your opponent can just be like, oh, well, they should be playing 3 Switch, or they should be playing 3 Boss. And you can just not sometimes, and you won't get punished for that tournament, and you can be fine, or until the finals. But yeah, building decks online are completely different.
Yeah, it makes sense. Speaking of decks, I'll let Joe kick things off with some of the decks. Obviously, Mew has been kind of dominating, but we have a couple of decks we want to talk about. But yeah, I'll pass over to Joe to kick some more specific questions off.
I was going to do just one more sort of broad one, just really about Brilliant Stars, because Henry, you won a World Championships with a new set coming out. So obviously you have a good grasp of identifying key cards and how powerful they are just on the jump. So what are the big sort of key cards that you were looking at for Brilliant Stars? Obviously Arceus is there for all to see. Do you have a favorite partner for it so far, or are there any other hidden gems in Brilliant Stars that are still to be uncovered for you?
I think that, I mean, obviously Arceus, in terms of standalone archetypes, like we'll talk, I'm sure, in time about how the cards influence Mew and other decks. But in terms of Arceus specifically, I think assessing what it does and how you kind of want to utilize that is really important. So it can do one of two things. It can either use itself to set up your engine, or you can set up your deck and use it as a way to essentially guarantee power plays throughout the game. So you could play a couple techs like a Charon's or a Raihan and use it as a pseudo Luminion, which obviously is much better in terms of not giving up a liability on the bench. And it's also a self-sufficient card. And so you can use it as an enabler, or you can use it as a deck itself. And not only is the ability self-sufficient with the card, the attack is as well. So it as a package is basically like incredibly self-sufficient. And so I saw Todd was playing a list, for example, which had the Tempting Tune, Altaria, and Oranguru. And so you set up with Starbirth, you grab your double turbo and your cards you need for turn 2, and then for the rest of the game you're kind of just going to say boss's orders because all your attackers are powered up by your attack and you've got your cards from Starbirth, and so you don't really need anything for the rest of the game, and you hit enough damage that you take 2 prizes. And so just by virtue of that, like you just get everything, and that's probably the strength there. But I think, which I'm sure we'll touch on, it doesn't quite have what it needs to take out Mew in that kind of form.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. So let's move on to real decks then. And I think everyone has Mew as the top of their radar. Natalie, can you give us a reason that you should play Mew for Brisbane and a reason why maybe you're put off playing Mew as well?
Well, the reason you play Mew is that it's just so absurd. Like, the deck is insanely consistent. The rate you brick is so low compared to any other deck, which is massive. The deck is good going first and going second, which is huge because every other deck really needs to go first. Whereas Mew is fine going second. The reason not to play it is that everyone else knows this. So
yeah.
Everyone's gonna have a plan to beat Mew, I guess.
Yeah, it feels like you say, the deck is so far like head and shoulders above everything else right now. It's also got that target on its back, and a lot of times there will be decks like that. There'll be specific archetypes that a lot of people are looking to counter anyway. But Mew, like you say, is just so good. It feels like no matter what, everyone also will have tested like hundreds of games against Mew because they know it's going to be a huge percentage of the field. So everyone is not only going to have that game plan, but is going to have practiced that game plan as well. So they're going to you have to expect they're going to feel comfortable if you turn over a Mew, and they're going to kind of know exactly what they need to be doing. And I guess it's just about weighing up whether, even in the situations where they get their game plan and they are able to do everything they want, Mew is just so strong. It doesn't really care. It can do whatever it wants. It draws so many cards. It can create so many awkward plays. It has so many different sort of options for the deck. It's like the attacks within the deck are so varied, even though there's only 3 Pokemon essentially in the deck, or 4 Pokemon in the deck, that it really can do so many different things. So yeah, like you say, it feels like it can sometimes even not be put off by the massive target on its head right now because it's just so powerful. Yeah,
I actually want to talk about. I have an interesting correlation I've seen with Mew in online tournaments recently, and I think you were saying people are going to be countering and have practiced the matchup, but we're seeing a correlation where basically these decks that counter Mew will beat it in the early rounds, and then you get to about round 8 or 9 or 10 or whatever these online tournaments, and then suddenly it'll lose to 2 Mews in a row. And it's because, at least the way I read it, is that the skill level of the Mew players in the later rounds are so much higher, and despite what people say because of the way the deck seems, it is pretty skill expressive in a lot of ways, that the difference between a top and an average Mew player is massive in these counter matchups. And so you have people trying to essentially play color match with Dark against Psychic, and it just doesn't work because they can't win the prize trade against Meloetta, or they, like, the single prize Dark deck, Mew can just use a Mew twice in a row, and then Psychic Leap it away, and then just kind of play the prize denial, and so it just doesn't work half the time. And I think people might get caught up a little bit on that kind of beating the wrong Mew player.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. It's like you say, it very much feels like, well, that correlation there does definitely dictate that people who have been able to get to the sort of X and O records with Mew, naturally, again, in the inverse, have probably played against a lot of these counter decks a lot because they need to develop an idea of the matchup in their head, and therefore are able to hone in on exactly what they need to do. And like you say, mentioning the prize denial and jumping in with Psychic Leap are two like massive points of that matchup where basically if done at the right time, it's almost like even these counter decks don't have enough time to take enough prizes anymore because all of a sudden there's no 3 prizes on the board or whatever. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting one to see kind of that balance of whether all of these, because there's like 4 or 5 different single prize dark counter decks that all really try and heavily target Mew. It'll be interesting to see how they fare in some of these regionals coming up. The other kind of big titan of the format is Arceus, and we've already touched on it a little bit. Just in general, because Arceus is such a broad sort of beast to handle, I'm going to kind of pass the floor over to you, Natalie. What's your favourite Arceus deck that you've been playing out so far?
Well, all the Arceus decks I've tried have just kind of felt a bit mid, I guess. I tried a lot of them. I tried Arceus Duraludon, and that deck kind of felt okay, I guess was the best way to describe it.
Yeah.
Felt very shaky. You could beat a Mew player who didn't really know what they're doing, but against people who knew what they were doing, like, I agree with Henry, the deck is really deceptively hard to play.
Yeah.
So, against a Mew player who knew what they were doing, the matchup felt so difficult. And if Arceus Duraludon isn't beating Mew, the deck is just kind of worthless.
Yeah.
Because that, in theory, should be your best matchup. In terms of other Arceus decks, I've tried Arceus Dark, which has felt okay. Again. I tried some Arceus Inteleon decks. I've seen that popping up a lot, and I felt like the only deck that could actually play the game against Mew.
Okay.
Because you would just try to force them to go through 2 Arceus with big charms.
Yeah. I think the Arceus, the straight Arceus build has definitely popped up and been quite popular more recently. And yeah, like you say, having like 310 HP on a 2 prizer is very different to 310 HP on a 3 prizer, and it's actually it's manageable in some of these VMAX matchups because there's 1 prize and 2 prizes you can pick up here and there. But Arceus VSTAR with 310 HP, and especially if they're playing things like the Dunsparce and stuff, so you can't even try and cheese that weakness, is it's a lot of HP to get through, and when you're only getting 2 prizes for that at the end of the day, it's really not particularly nice to deal with. So yeah, I think even though they're quite new to the meta over the past sort of 3 or 4 days, I think they're quickly going to start to gain popularity because, like you say, they don't look to counter or beat like a specific matchup through typing, but it's just trying to really lean into the consistency and the raw stats on Arceus and just say, this is too much for decks to handle. Even Mew, it's too much to handle. So yeah, I actually need to test out some of the straight Arceus more for sure. Henry, what about you? Is there any Arceus builds that have stood out to you so far?
I've tested an extensive amount, primarily the Mew matchup. So my testing for Brisbane has basically been, I'll play Arceus, I'll put together 60 cards, and can I get it to beat Mew? And I won't touch any other matchup until that's done. And because the thing with Arceus is you kind of beat every other matchup going first anyway. And so if you've got a 50-50 automatically because your deck's so dumb going first that you're going to be able to boss KO anything, then you just kind of have to beat Mew. And I think the issue is that you can't really do that, and there's a couple specific reasons why. So the Arceus Inteleon lists don't have enough outs to Arceus turn 1 often, and it's just unreliable, and then you play your hand down kind of poorly. The other issue is that Big Charm doesn't quite work. There's 2 flaws with it. First one, if they play well, it's difficult for you to deal with 4 Energy Melodious Echo in a lot of situations, because for some reason, Fan of Waves puts it to the deck, not the discard pile. So you can try and use like Cry of Destruction, but the problem is as well that loses you too much tempo. And with Double Turbo, it doesn't do a whole lot. And the other thing as well is people started to play Echoing Horn as a Duraludon counter, and that kind of negates the whole resource war you're going for with Big Charm anyway. And if you're just like hitting the active every time because you're trying to find all these like Big Charms and set up your board and everything, it just doesn't quite work. I do, however, very much enjoy the deck. I would say that straight Arceus is my front runner because I don't think that the Dark Arceus is as good. But all of the engines feel pretty good with that deck, so take it as you will.
Yeah, makes sense.
Let's move on to some path-based decks, because we've talked about Mew and we've talked about Arceus, and their strengths are both centered around their abilities. and you guys have been saying that prize races are pretty difficult to beat Mew unless you just completely stonewall stop them with a path sometimes, right? So what do you guys think about like a straight Ice Rider with Inteleon? Natalie, do you have any thoughts on Ice Rider in this format? With the inclusion of the belt, it seems like a much better card, right?
Yeah, that sounds like a very easy way to lose to Mew.
Okay.
It's felt like
Sorry,
any
us
deck
Australians are a bit doomed here.
Yeah. I mean, the issue with most of the path decks is that even if you go first and hit turn 1 path, you don't actually beat Mew.
Sure.
Like, especially, I've noticed playing against stuff like Jolteon and Ice Rider, just Mew plus 2 energy, not even drawing cards is enough to...
Right. Yeah.
Because the deck's inherent strategy is so awful that it's just not good enough to beat Mew, even without the ability. So, yeah, that's kind of my thought on it. Just stay away from Ice Rider.
Does that put you off like every path deck in general, or do you feel like there's some decks that are like, even Arceus adding in a path, do you think is that a strong enough like draw towards having it? Like, does that count as a Mew answer in your opinion?
So I think one path is not a Mew answer because the best way to do it is turn 1 going first.
Sure.
And you have to actually play a deck that can beat Mew even with that. And so far the only deck I've found that can do that is Gengar, because it has the dark weakness and it has the 2 energy attack that actually allows it to trade against Mew, whereas the other path decks just can't do that. I think if you're just playing one path to try and hit it as attack in the mid game, it's just not going to do anything, because by then, it's different if Mew knows about the path versus if they don't. If they know, they'll just hold a stadium in their hand and you can't do anything. If they don't know, they'll have just set up their board as well, so you have to path itself won't beat Mew, you have to also actually beat them, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so let's move on to Gengar then. Henry, what are your thoughts on that? Is that one of the best ways to beat Mew just in general? It doesn't seem to have a well-rounded matchup spread, but by what we're hearing so far, there's a lot of people just think Mew is that good. Do you think you can face enough of them and go deep with Gengar?
I think so. This is the sad thing. I think that Gengar, initially people obviously color match and they play Gengar. And without the path, because originally I was saying don't count path into your Mew game plan because it's not going to work half the time. But you're 50-50 with Mew without the path, and that's kind of being generous maybe. So you kind of need it. And I think what Natalie is saying is that if you path every turn, which is kind of difficult because you need to play Crobat, but if you path every turn and apply pressure rather than just kind of put the path down and do nothing, like Jolteon or something, even Arceus is a bit, you have to basically be demanding resources from them. And so even if they bump the path, you're saying that statistically, because you have a path out, that's one less way for that card to be a power tablet that you need, or an energy that you need, or a VMAX. And so it's not realistic for it to never get bumped or stick, but it just makes them need that little bit more that, maybe 2 out of 4 games it'll do something. So I think it's pretty reasonable in Gengar. I think that you're going to play a lot of Mew, but touching on Ice Rider, like you said, you could totally just, I don't think for this tournament, but maybe, a little bit later in the format when people realize that if they want to play Mew, then they're just going to be chewing glass. They can they can play Ice Rider and be like, oh, well, my deck's pretty strong against everything else because it's just not Mew. And then kind of throw that and maybe, 60-40 everything else. And that might be a decent way to play the game.
Yeah, that's something that's interesting, and just kind of going, this is something that I probably should have picked up on the Mew aspect, but I know obviously the size of regionals over in Australia is different to in Europe and America. Typically they're a little bit smaller, so I think usually it's 7 or 8 rounds into a top 8 cut for you more often than it's very rarely moving into the top 32s that we see in sort of Europe and Australia. So because of that, how many Mews are you expecting to see turn 1 in say 7 or 8 rounds? And because of that, are you do you think you'll see enough to be able to play a deck that has a good Mew matchup, kind of locks in almost, if you can, really targeting that Mew, maybe trying to get that to a 60-40, kind of hoping that you don't see as many of these other decks and try and win with some maybe techs that you're playing or things that people aren't expecting in closed deck list? I don't know, because in a 9-round tournament, I feel like it's difficult to kind of predict. I feel like you're never going to see more than 3 of the same deck in a lot of instances of a 9-round tournament, which means I feel like it's harder to focus on one matchup. Whereas some like 7-round tournaments, I could see I've played sort of 7-round cups where it's been like back to back to back to back the best deck in format, just because people just want to push to top 8. So I don't know whether that's something that comes into mind when you're deciding your deck. But yeah, how many kind of Mews are you expected to see on day 1?
I think it's kind of, instead of looking at how many Mews you expect to see, I would look at how many losses you can afford.
Okay.
And a lot of the time, I think you can take the risks for a 9-round tournament, because at a 7 or 8-round tournament, usually you can only afford 1 loss.
Yeah.
And if you play a deck to try to counter Mew, and like you said, you can only get to 60-40. So that means if you play against 3 or 4 Mews, statistically, you're probably going to lose to one of them.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say you go 3-1 against Mew, you're going to have to go like 3-0-1 against all the not Mew decks.
Yeah.
And that's just really hard to do.
Yeah.
It's so difficult to find that balance.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in a 9-round tournament, yeah, you can afford to, or like, yeah, you'll maybe only see 3 Mews in 9 rounds, but you can afford 2 losses against the not Mew decks, which is massive.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think that there's a couple interesting ways to look at this. So first off, in terms of Mew versus other decks, is that I think that obviously everyone agrees Mew's the best deck. The better you are at the game, the better the deck is going to be as well, which is, you know, more incentive to play it if you're a better player. So, you know, if the better players in Australia will play it, then if you're somehow a scientist that managed to have a good Mew matchup, then it's probably better to flip the other matchups than Mew, because statistically, if the better players are playing Mew, the players playing not Mew should be of a slightly lower skill, and so it's better to flip a matchup where you might be able to win just by playing better than, you know, Mew. And I really would not want to flip Mew unless I'm playing the deck myself. But also it factors in like top 8 as well. Like, I don't know if you guys have seen regionals results in the past for Australia, but it's like you could pretty much pick like 6 out of 8 of the players from the top 8 of the leaderboards, and they'll be in top 8 of cut at our regionals like every single time. And if you assume, well, those are the best players, they're going to play Mew, then you're going to have 6 Mew decks in top 8. And if you want to win the tournament, then you better be able to bloody beat Mew.
Yeah, I'm going to say it's one of those, again, similar to kind of the skill that Natalie mentioned. It's also a skill thinking about what can get you to top 8. But when if you feel that you can get to top 8, what puts you in the best position in that single elimination bracket to make it all the way, or whether you're just going for the top 8 points because that's what you need for your invite or whatever, that kind of thing. It's definitely something that is another skill to weigh up for sure. Are you expecting to see like 6 Mews in top 8 then, or do you think there will be a wide enough variety? Or because obviously we don't Discord with the Australian community too much. I don't know what the Australian community is feeling about Mew, but are a lot of top players all going, yeah, Mew is busted, I'm not even trying to do anything funky anymore, I just want to play the best deck, it draws the most cards, it has the most outs, it doesn't brick. Henry, how many Mews are you expecting to make it all the way through?
I would say a fair few. I think that people would very much not describe Mew as a deck that I would play, by the way that I think Natalie maybe agrees with that, but just in terms of how the deck functions and the fact that I'm heavily considering playing Mew means that I would expect a lot of it. I think that you're just going to see a ton. I think you'll see, my prediction would be 4 Mew, 2 random decks, 2 Mew counters that have managed to make it through Swiss, and then the Mew counters lose to Mew in top 8.
So just on all this Mew hype, Natalie, what would be like mirror text? Does that just seem like the smartest thing? Is it Pokemon Catcher? Is it a second copy of Choice Belt? What do you think is like going to give you any edge outside of like winning coin flips? Or do you even just try and play the odds and like go second and try and really like just take first prizes and ride that wave? Do you have major game plans into a Mew mirror, or do you want to try and commit space to techs?
The Mew mirror is so strange because it feels like the deck is, the mirror. The mirror is actually really skill based, but also there's so much randomness, and it's just both completely determine the game. Like, I've played a lot of Mew mirrors, especially on PTCGO, where the opponent just does not know what they're doing, and even though they drew a lot better than I did, I still win the mirror because they just took a wrong game plan at some point. But there are definitely games where it just comes down to whoever draws better. And I think for mirror techs, I would just... Honestly, the best advice is just don't dirt draw. Just try and avoid those triple boss, triple VMAX hands.
Sure.
Because when I've been testing, that's... Honestly, most games you lose are just the games you dead draw. And just try and avoid that as much as possible.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Do you have any tech ideas, Henry? Or do you think it's just make the most consistent deck even more consistent than anyone else?
I mean, that's kind of it, right? I think that what Natalie's saying is really good, though. And this comes again to, like, picking Mew. And I've been talking about this pretty much the whole time. But the mirror having, like, some pretty, deep lines is another reason to play the deck, because you can kind of coast through mirrors on day one. As Natalie also said, the mirror does, however, kind of get silly at some point because you get to some board states where it's just, well, does one player hit 4 mods or not? And if they do, they win. If they don't, they lose. But to actually, force that, it can be done. And I think just knowing how to do that is really good. In terms of techs, I think that this is not a Mew mirror tech, but by tech, like Echoing Horn, I think is an insane tech in like every other matchup. Like literally every other matchup, it's just so strong. But the problem is it's basically a dead card in the Mew mirror. And so you're weakening your deck in the mirror by playing essentially a 59 card list for it. Now, things like Oricorio can help certain situations, like everyone's playing double rope now. But I think there's not a ton of techs particularly that you can really do a whole lot with.
It feels like a lot of the techs are so dead in the first 30 cards of the deck because the first 30 cards are basically just finding Alyssa Sparkle, right? Or finding boss or whatever. So all of these techs like the horn and the big charm and all of that stuff you don't want to see until like turn 3 or 4 when you've been able to turbo through your deck. And that means it's really weird to add a tech to a deck where you just don't care about it in the first turn. Even if it is something like a big charm that's insta-playable or whatever, you never want to see that over a ball search card or an energy card in the case of like going second or anything like that. So yeah, it's a really weird deck to try and tech because half the time you just don't care about what's in your deck. You just want to draw as many cards as possible and then end up discarding them with quick balls and ultra balls anyway. It doesn't matter the actual cards in the deck.
Yeah, I will say just quickly, I saw this in chat. Second or higher counts of double turbo energy is quite good in the mirror. Over the at least 2, and I mean just more consistency is another good tech as well.
Yeah, for sure. A couple of other decks I just want to touch on before we wrap things up. We're not going to stay for too long, but yeah. First things first is some of these single prize decks. Obviously, we've talked a little bit about the dark counter decks that really look to focus Mew, and Henry, you've kind of alluded to some of these decks being able to beat some of the more inexperienced Mew players, but some of the more experienced Mew players will have had so much practice in these matchups, especially given that they were also very, very relevant in the Fusion Strike meta, that they have natural game plans. And in all honesty, Mew probably gained more from the new sets than some of these dark decks did. So realistically, one like Mew is just even better now. But one that we haven't touched on that is a real contentious one is Rapid Strike Mali. Some people absolutely love the deck. Some people absolutely hate the deck. Some people like the Inteleon build. Some people like the Cincino build. There's a lot. I feel there's a lot to talk about with the deck. It's quite interesting. Its win rate has started to drop off recently. It was quite popular in the first couple of weeks or the first couple of days, but it started to drop off. But equally, people not really respecting it, not respecting things like boss in it or rope in it, that kind of thing. There's a lot to the deck, I think. Natalie, have you played much Rapid Strike Mali? How do you feel about the deck? It's a very, very polarizing one.
Yeah, I actually kind of feel neutral about it. It just feels like this deck we've seen time and time again. It's this deck that has consistency problems, but in theory can beat everything.
Yeah.
It's basically Greninja all over again.
Yeah, and to be honest, as we've mentioned so many times about consistency, they're not the kind of decks you typically want to be taking to a tournament because they're the ones that you need to run a little bit hotter with. You need to be on the right side of things in terms of luck in some instances to be able to get your board into a state where you can beat anything. But like you say, realistically, it feels like some of these decks can beat anything. The other one is sort of any of the other individual single prize dark decks, Henry. Are there any that actually stand out to you, or do you feel they're all not great?
So I think a lot of single prize decks have a couple issues at the moment. I actually want to touch on a thing that happened to me the other day playing against Rapid Strike Malamar. So I went to locals because I haven't played the game in 2 years in person, and I was like, you know what, I'm gonna get some games in so that I actually remember what I'm doing. And I get there and I was playing against I was playing Mew and I played against Malamar, and I forgot about DTE double turbo when I was doing it, so I didn't get a knockout on the Malamar, and so I ended up losing by 1 prize. But the game took a while, and I just scooped game 2 and just like went and got a drink because we're not going to finish in like 3 games in 50 minutes. Like we might have tied or something. But these single prize decks are really going to struggle finishing 3 games in 50 minutes, given the game plans that can kind of happen, because, you know, both players have to take 6 prizes with long turns as well. So with that said, I think that the single prize dark deck has pretty weak game plans against a few decks. So if you look at it, you can look at a lot of like Limit the Starter and stuff, which is actually quite interesting for decks like this, but I think it's got something like a 20% win rate against Duraludon or something, which is like...
Yeah, it's low.
I'm sorry, like, no matter what you think about Duraludon, because it's just no good. And I think when talking about these decks, like, it's almost worth ignoring Mew to a degree so you don't completely destroy your, you know, positive mental attitude. But the single prize dark deck, whilst it can beat Mew, has a fairly difficult matchup spread against other things, and I think the Rapid Strike Malamar is probably the better of the bunch when it comes to the single prize things.
Yeah.
I've seen the Zoroark toolbox, which is really, really cool, but has consistency issues and needs to dedicate a large amount of space to beat Mew as well, playing the Moltres and things like that. So I like that single prize decks are in a place where they can be played and they have, you know, good matchups, but I think that I'd be hesitant to pick one going into the regionals in the next 2 weeks.
Makes sense.
Awesome. So is there any other deck that you in particular have tested a lot or are expecting to show up that we haven't mentioned today for Brisbane? Or are we feeling it's like a closed meta where there's going to be a variety package of Arceus decks, lots of Mew, and then a variety of dark decks as well? Does that more or less like encompass what you're expecting for Brisbane? Or is there anything else for either of you?
It's kind of weird to think about this being a closed format since the set isn't even legal yet.
Yeah.
So, like, the set's been out for about a week, and we've just been grinding it so much to prepare for regionals, but I don't really see what can happen. But I don't know, there has to be something, I think. Like, surely this cannot be it for the format. We have not had it for enough time to fully explore everything, I think.
Yeah, it definitely feels like Arceus is the most like breakable. I think as you've already said earlier, Natalie, nothing's felt phenomenal with Arceus just yet, especially into that like Mew game plan. But there could be some concoction out there that makes it happen, and that's like waiting to be explored. I still think.
I think that I don't know about this being, you know, a deck to win the tournament, but in terms of a deck you'll see. Do we want to touch on Durant?
You've said it now.
The floor is yours.
Okay. This deck, I don't know how it wins games. I guess if you open like Luminion and they mill your 4-switch, then you probably lose. But I think that there was a post in one of the Australian groups today saying Mill is playable again, love heart eyes emoji. And so I think you can see a lot of people like that just taking Mill to regionals and flipping over their opponent's cards from their deck, which cannot be COVID safe. But, you know, it's I think people are going to play it. I think for anyone watching, if you're playing against Durand, just don't play cards, just attack.
Yeah, I mean,
sums it up well.
Yeah, it's definitely something that we've touched on already, but the difference between players that have just got into the game in the online era and players that will have had experience against these Miller control decks in a timed format as well, because playing timely against these decks can be very important. Less so Mill, but definitely control decks. It's important to always have the clock on the mind and make sure that you're in a position where you know when you need to scoop and that kind of thing, if you think you're in a point where you're not going to be able to win the game. So it's definitely going to be an interesting one to see how some of these strategies translate to the IRL field. So the final thing we wanted to ask is basically the end of every conversation like these. If Brisbane was in 1 hour from now, Henry, what would be the 60 cards you were writing down? Not the exact 60, but what deck would you be? What deck would you be writing down and heading into round 1 with?
If I wanted to absolutely do the best that I think I could, I would play Mew. If I wanted to reject the status quo and not play Mew, I would play a straight Arceus deck with Big Charm.
Wonderful. And Natalie?
I would be writing down 4 Mew V, 3 Mew VMAX, 4 Genesect.
Keep going. I need this list. This is fine. We will be noting this down. Yeah, I mean, it was probably a question that was the answer was fairly predictable, but we had to ask it anyway. But yeah, thanks so much for joining us. We didn't want to make this sort of a long, drawn-out conversation. We just wanted to get some initial thoughts. Like I mentioned at the start, we're going to have lots of other people throughout the weeks. Basically, we're going to try and hone in for whatever region is having the regional that weekend. So next week, we'll hopefully be able to grab some American people that will be heading to Salt Lake City. But yeah, other than that, make sure you check out Natalie and Henry on Twitter. I'll leave both of their links to their Twitters below. And yeah, best of luck, you two, for Brisbane this weekend. Hope to see you all the way in the top 8. And hopefully, imagine a Natalie and Henry final. That would be wonderful. So yeah, that would be great. Thanks for watching, everybody. And yeah, cheers. See you again soon.